Hi, this is Bob Murphy, and you're listening to the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome to the show that gets Christians thinking about faith and politics. Get ready to challenge the status quo, expand your imagination, and tackle controversy head on. Let's stand together at the intersection of faith and freedom. It's time for the Libertarian Christian Podcast.
Welcome, everybody, to the Libertarian Christian Podcast, a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute. I'm Norman Horn.
And I'm Doug Stewart.
And today we are joined by CJay Engel, the editor of reformedlibertycom. He's also an entrepreneur and has been published in a number of places, including LouRockwell.com, Mises.org, and you can definitely find him there as a regular editor of the FedWatch series. Reformedlibertarian.com is a wonderful website, and we highly recommend it. It's a great place to learn about fundamentals of libertarianism, great ideas about theology, and especially if you're interested in Reformed theology, CJay is an expert on that as well. We are very happy to welcome him to the LCI podcast here. So thanks for joining us, CJay.
Glad to be here. Thanks, guys.
So first off, let's talk a little bit about reformedlibertarian.com. Tell us how you got it started with it and a little bit about what you like to do with it there.
Well, like most blogs, I started off by, wanting to write a lot more than I actually was able to write on. And so I just created a regular old blogger domain, and I just got started writing, and I knew nothing at the time. And I just kind of went from there. And as I learned, I would continue to expand until I was able to actually buy a domain that I thought accurately represented what I wanted to say and talk about. So, first it started like that with 0 readers. Over time, I began to develop things and actually come to positions that I could defend on a consistent basis. And then I, took it to the next level and, worked on podcasts and got some pretty nice community going on Facebook and making a lot of friends. So it started small. It's getting bigger, and I was just looking at my statistics the other day, and I'm just surprised about how many similar-minded people there are on the internet. When I got started, I thought I was one of the only Christian libertarians in the world, and then you come to realize that there's so many others, and it's a growing number every day. So it's just a great place for me to express myself, to develop my own thinking, and to focus on whatever connections there are to be found on things related to religion, and more specifically Protestant religion and libertarian political theory.
Awesome. And yeah, it's been great to watch it grow and to see you adding new writers and to develop your Facebook group. And there's a lot of fun things that you guys have going on there. It's really fun to see. And I'm just proud to be, a little bit of a part of that as best I can be as well. So yeah, again, glad to watch it and glad to have you here. One of the things that we wanted to bring you in and talk about, though, is something that we've noted that you've had to deal with it a little bit more than we have at times, and that's the ideas surrounding theonomic Reconstructionism. And so I want to begin, though, with a few definitions at first, because as we talk about theonomic Reconstructionism and libertarianism, we can sometimes get a little confused as to what we're talking about at times, and so I think let's get some baseline definitions out there. So for our listeners' sake, how about you, from your point of view, CJay, why don't you define libertarianism in whatever manner you see fit at the moment? And then especially for us as Christians, what are the implications for that theologically for us?
Yeah, I think that libertarianism, when we talk about the definition of it, I think we should always start by asking, what are we engaging, what are we trying to accomplish when we talk about or investigate political theory? I think that, you can't just jump right into it, because then sometimes just, based on our, what we might call a statist mindset, we kind of interpret political theory in light of our current political system. And then we get caught up with all kinds of things like, well, is it similar to republicanism or, democracy, or, how does the representative nature of our, democracy fit into the whole equation? And so I think you need to start farther back than that and ask the question, well, what are we actually trying to accomplish when we talk about political theory? And without getting into the various options, I think, the conclusion, at least that I found, is that I think we can boil it down to, we're trying to figure out, when is coercion justified? When are we allowed to use physical aggression against other people. What acts of violence are legitimate and which are not legitimate. And I think those are the types of questions that we ask in political theory. So the conclusion of the libertarian is that the only times we're allowed to use force in a situation is in self-defense or possibly in response to someone that has previously aggressed against the person or property of another individual. Other than that, we have this phrase, the non-aggression principle. We're not allowed to aggress against the private property or body of some other individual for any other reason. So we can't just initiate violence. Rather, we can only use physical violence to defend ourselves or by way of prosecution in response to or after someone has previously used violence on you. So that's kind of the summary statement of libertarianism. It has to do with rights, and it distinguishes between legitimate uses of force and illegitimate uses of force.
So what are some of the touch points with our Christian point of view, our theology, and why that's important to us as Christians?
I think for me, the main connection here is that, as Christians, we have a worldview, right? We have a system of beliefs, and we want to convince others of these beliefs, right? Because we adhere to the idea that we're actually saved by our beliefs, right? We're saved by faith. And so if we are saved and we want others to be saved, then we want to have other people believe the same things that we believe. And so the tools that we've been given to help in that are persuasion and argumentation, right? We're allowed to argue, defend ourselves intellectually, and persuade other people to, believe in the gospel. But what we're not allowed to do, and what doesn't help promote the kingdom of heaven, is to use the sword, right? Is to use physical violence to initiate other people's rights and force them to believe, to force a confession out of their mouth or change their behavior by way of physical violence or threats of violence, or at a more systematic level, using the government to do such violence for you, right? So these are illegitimate ways of spreading the gospel. But as Christians, I think we should follow Christ's example and use persuasion and peaceful means.
So in other words, a forced religion is hardly a religion at all in this case.
Right. So if religion means worldview, right? If it's a system of beliefs, you can't force anyone to believe something. You can definitely force someone to say they believe. You can definitely make them mimic your words. I'm sure there's a lot of things I would say if someone held a gun to my head, but God isn't interested in such outward acts, right? He's only interested in the heart, and that can't be changed by physical violence.
Right. So theonomic Reconstructionism is something that perhaps some people are unfamiliar with as a term with our listeners, but maybe they've heard certain ideas either on the internet or from certain speakers or from their churches, and because it kind of has made the rounds, especially in the last 10 or 20 years. So can you give us a good definition of what theonomic Reconstructionism is, and perhaps some of the fundamental assumptions, and eventually we'll get into how this kind of relates to libertarian ideas.
And you also may want to include what other names of or buzzwords that people who are theonomists may use to help people understand, like when they're reading something, it may not be obvious that they're reading a theonomy website or something like that, even, because the views may be similar to what they're used to hearing. They're just hearing them in a different way.
Right. Yeah, exactly. And that's part of the difficulty too, is that, and this isn't just a problem with theonomists, but in general, a lot of people from different camps will use the same phrases but mean something totally different. And this is actually a really dangerous thing that people will use to create revolutions, right? The socialists took over the word liberal at the end of the 19th century, right? And so we have to always be aware of, okay, you're using that phrase, but what's the context you're using it in? What are the underlying assumptions surrounding that phrase that's going to affect whether or not I can actually agree with you? So, that's always a key point. But I think the best way to summarize it is just in the question of whether or not a government today is mandated to apply the Mosaic civil laws to present day society. So I think it's important to clarify it like this, because sometimes people will say, well, do we want God's law or man's law? But, that's such a vague phrase that we have to get very specific about it. And I think the specific differentiation between even there, we can talk about the differences between a general theonomy and Reconstructionism, but I think that the theonomists would be specific about the Mosaic civil law. So what that means is, in the Bible, there was the Mosaic covenant that God made with Moses on behalf of the Israelite people. And those even those who have never read the Bible, they're aware of the book of Leviticus and all the myriad laws that regulate the way that we interact with each other and interact with everything that have to do with Israel's civil life, right? So there's so many laws. These were the civil laws regulating Israel, and they were Mosaic because they were underneath the Mosaic covenant. We could distinguish between the Mosaic covenant specifically and laws outside of that, such as when God was commanding Adam and Eve to do such and such. That wouldn't be obviously a Mosaic law. So specifically, the debate is over whether or not the civil laws of what older theologians refer to as the Mosaic economy, whether or not these civil laws under the Mosaic economy are mandated for governments to put in practice today in the 21st century, but more theologically specific under the economy of the new covenant. Okay, so that's the whole covenant paradigm is going to be very important as we get into the differences and why I'm not a theonomist and why I don't think the libertarian, should be a theonomist.
So is it important to differentiate theonomy and Reconstructionism? Are those two words that need to be parsed separately, or when we say theonomy, we mean Reconstructionism as well?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So, historically, I think a broader phrase would be something like theocracy, right? The law of God, is the law for man, right? The law of God is to be the thing that determines what is criminal and what is not criminal, right? Theocracy, God is in charge, or God's law. It was actually a later theonomist, a Reconstructionist, not a student, but a follower of, a man by the name of R.J. Rushdoony, who was sort of the father of what's called Reconstructionism. So R.J. Rushdoony was in the early 20th century, and he coined this phrase, Christian Reconstruction, on the basis that the Christian life is not something that's just focused on the kingdom of heaven, but it has a holistic aspect to it, which we all agree with, I think. But, his point was we need to reconstruct society in light of the fact that these components of Christian life are going to become the mainstream before Christ comes back. That's another, that's part and parcel of what's called the postmillennial view of, eschatology. See, these are big words, but all that means is that Jesus is going to come back after this 1,000-year reign, or not this 1,000-year reign, but this 1,000-year, period where the church and God's law are, mainstream. They're the operating framework under which society has been organized. So that's the postmillennial view. So Reconstruction aims to reconstruct everything from law, economics, government, philosophy. Every component to life has to be reconstructed according to the Christian worldview, right? That was the thesis of R.J. Rushdoony. Theonomy was a phrase that was coined later by one of his followers named Greg Bahnsen. Bahnsen's probably the most important popularizer, or one of them. Gary North would be the other one. But Greg Bahnsen's the one that coined the phrase theonomy and really put it into use. So you could use either one. I think what I would say is Reconstruction is more specific to Rushdoony's books, and theonomy is more of the general term of applying the Mosaic civil law to today.
So that's a good point, and something I hadn't realized even in my own studies, that Bahnsen was the guy that really popularized the use of the word theonomy in this type of philosophy. So there's some good history there to remember as you go forward. And it's interesting you mentioned that there are some appealing aspects. This the holistic view of Christianity is something that a lot of us who care about theology, we really want that to be part of our lives. We want there to be a permeation of our theology in all sorts of things of what we do. But this is maybe a little overdone as it is. And that may be one of the problems with it, even though it is appealing. Are there other appealing aspects, though, to theonomic Reconstructionism that, like, why does it attract people?
That's a good psychological question, but I think, if I could point out to a number of motivations, just one of them for my own life, when I was dealing with these things, I began to see the importance of having a Christian input, right, into our political theory, and the vocabulary that is used by the theonomists can be tempting for someone that's trying to accomplish this, right? That's learning about the possibilities of the components of his political theory. And I think that, one of the most compelling things is just the way that it's marketed. I don't mean that in a bad way, right? But everyone has to have their way of convincing people of their position. So the way that it's marketed is just, look, we have to choose between God's law and man's law, and what's better, the mind of God or the mind of man, right? So that's a very simple way of putting it, and that can be compelling, right? Well, we think that God's mind is more knowledgeable and obviously more truthful, and so therefore we want to use that framework instead of whatever man can conjure up. After all, man has conjured up all kinds of disastrous and devastating systems, political frameworks and governments, and the state. The mind has done some very devastating things for humanity. Therefore, there's got to be a better way, right? So that would be kind of what's compelling about it. Unfortunately, I don't think that really gets into the heart of the matter, and it can be misleading if we just stop there and don't go deeper into that. But I think that would be the most compelling thing for Christians if they're saying, look at the consequences of doing things man way. There's got to be something better. The theonomists are, preaching the idea that they've, are pushing God's law. That's got to be a whole lot better than the tragedies of state socialism and fascism and all these other things, right? So I think that would be the most compelling, at least for me, and I think for a lot of Christians, until you dig deeper and you find out there's different ways to parse this and there's better options.
Yeah, you mentioned that this question that can come up, divine. Do you want to choose God's law or do you want to choose human autonomy? You get to choose. And it does seem like it's kind of putting you as a Christian in sort of a trap position, right? It's like, well, you obviously as a Christian, you definitely want to be on God's side. So you don't want to be on the side of, evil man.
And there's the assumption that they already know what God's law or God's quote unquote side is. Like, yeah, it's in the question is taken for granted that whatever they have in mind is, here's what God's law is, right?
Yeah, and so CJay, I'm wondering, you've hinted to this, but how do you respond to this inquiry? I mean, is it as much of a trap as it kind of seems to me?
Yeah, so you're referring to. I have a great little piece that can be referred to, whenever the listener wants to. It's called "Combating the Theonomist Trap," and the basic idea here is, look, we do want to choose between God and man, but the problem is that. What God is not happy with is us misinterpreting his law, right? So, he gives us this choice, this trap, God or man, and we come back and we say, well, God should be chosen before man's will, but God is not happy when we misunderstand or misexegete his law, right? So that's the first thing, and it's a little bit, I used to like that phrase, that choice. I thought it was real catchy, but it is kind of sneaky, and I don't think it really. Gives a lot of opportunity for the other side to actually give their to engage. I mean, it's a trap, and it's fine. I use traps all the time when I talk to socialists or other varieties of statists. But the point is that it's not really a trap because right. So it's not really a trap because. That you have to. That's just a phrase, God's law. Once you actually define what that means. That's when we can find our differences and our disagreements and actually dissent from the theonomist position, right? So the point there is that, yes, we have to choose between God or man. That's fine. But what is God? We have to define it. We can't just use a bumper sticker phrase, right?
Yeah. So this kind of flows into a good question about, law and gospel. This is a paradigm that, if for those of our listeners who are very into studying historical theology, the law and gospel paradigm is something that we hear about from Luther and from before then too in various ways. But it's something that has had great influence on us as Protestants, especially. And this is a particularly important paradigm even to the TR position, the theonomic Reconstructionist position as well. Can you describe this for us in the law and gospel paradigm briefly, and how theonomic Reconstructionism kind of mistakenly applies it here?
Well, I actually don't think it's directly as relevant as one might think, but it is indirectly relevant in the sense that there's different theories of or different traditions, I might say, of how the different covenants in the Bible relate to each other. So, my own position is that the new covenant, right, everything post Christ, basically, is the new covenant, and it's the covenant of grace. And it's contrasted with, this is important, it's contrasted with the old covenant, which is the covenant of works. Well, the theonomists actually don't believe that. They believe that this whole old and new covenant are actually not two different covenants. They're actually the same covenant. They're both the covenant of grace, and they have different administrators. Okay, so my position is that the old covenant is a separate and distinct covenant from the new covenant. The administrator of the old covenant would be Moses, and the administrator of the new covenant would be Christ. But for them, it's the same covenant. There's just different administrations of it. So Christ is now the better administrator of that same covenant of grace. But for me, there's a contrast between law and grace. Law was what was instilled to reveal man's sin, and then grace came along because man proved that he can't get away from his sin. He can't save himself, and he can't obey the strict standards of God by his doings, right? So therefore, Christ has to be there as a mediator, and it has to be a graceful relationship because nothing we do can satisfy God. Okay, so that's that contrast between law and grace. The theonomists think the whole thing is the covenant of grace, and the law was given as a graceful blessing for the Israelites, and so even it too is a sign of grace. The law itself is graceful. It's a graceful act of God. So they don't have that sharp contrast in their covenant theology. The whole thing is one covenant of grace, and the law, therefore, since the covenant is still in existence, the civil law is actually still applicable because the covenant never went away. But for me, the law, the old covenant did go away, and therefore, how can you apply a piece of a covenant that is no longer in existence?
Right. Okay. So what other theological problems do you kind of perceive as being, related to theonomy here? Is there anything else that is, we've talked about the long law and the covenants. We've talked a little bit about postmillennial thinking. What other theological problems do you perceive as some problematic here?
Well, I think those are the main things, and really, this is what I say. Whenever I talk about it, is that a lot of this really does come down to how you're going to frame the nature of covenant theology. I mean, there's nothing much you can say if you believe the covenant of today is the exact same covenant of Mosaic times. If the law was given for the covenant, and if the covenant is still in existence, it makes logical sense to keep the same laws, right? Unless, and this is part of their their hermeneutic, right? Unless there was an explicit abrogation of a specific law, there's no reason why we need to throw it away. So that's part of the thing. Whereas, for my framework, there's no reason we should assume that it's kept in because it's a whole different covenant, right? So really, a lot of this does boil down to covenant theology because it's going to drive the way that we interpret the applicability of the old.
One of the things that I've experienced when talking to what appear to be theonomists on, social media, Facebook, and things like that is they quote a lot of verses and they connect a lot of verses to each other. Why can't we just quote verses back at them to, quote unquote, disprove their position? I mean, why can't we throw something from Hebrews or Galatians? I mean, why is that an ineffective strategy to make the conversation, not necessarily like, win the argument per se, but at least have a productive argument by, quoting verses back at them. I mean, there seems to be a lot of verses in Hebrews, especially, and in Galatians. And if there are any theonomists out there listening, you're probably thinking, yeah, but you're just, you just don't understand what it means. I mean, so tell us a little bit about your experience maybe in Bible verse swapping, so to speak.
Yeah, I mean, so that's a great question. And just in general, I think we're all tempted to do that, right? You have a verse, I have a verse, and we can throw them at each other all day and see who comes up with the most verses in defense of their position. I think that we can do that for a whole number of different issues, whether it's Calvinism versus Arminianism or, grace and law distinction or eschatology, right? Soteriology. You can do that everything from angels to the church to baptism. The problem is that these verses are always interpreted from a more general framework. And so I think you have to get to the root of the matter, because it's not like these theonomists have never read Hebrews 6 or Galatians 3 or anything like that, right? They've all read them. They just interpret them according to their own framework. So, we do the same thing. And I think that we need to first talk about, how do we interpret these verses in light of our more general understanding of how the two covenants are put together. I think you have to start at that more general level, because each individual verse doesn't necessarily speak for itself. Scripture has to interpret Scripture, and therefore, then this is a problem too when you talk about Romans 13, right? People always start their political theology with Romans 13, but there's, and Norman, I know you've talked a lot about this. There's so many other places with implications for political theology, right? There's so many other places in the Bible that we can just throw verses at each other all day. First, we have to have more of a general framework, and then interpret Hebrews 6 and Hebrews 3 in light of that, right? So, a great example of this is the Calvinist Arminian debate. Well, the Calvinist has Romans 9, and he could throw that passage around to the Arminian all day, but it's not like they've never heard of it, right? They've heard of it. They just have a different way of interpreting it based on their other convictions, right? So, and I definitely think that using verses like Hebrews 6, and I think that you can use that and just ask them, what do you think about this verse in light of what you're saying? Is there any contradiction there? And I think that is helpful, but we also need to remember that they're approaching these verses, they're interpreting them based on their previous notions of how the Bible fits together in general.
CJay, we've already mentioned that there is a postmillennial eschatology that's associated with theonomists here. How significant is it to the theonomist position? And is there, how deeply does this run through their thinking, and what are the implications that it kind of brings forward here?
It's a difficult question because, technically speaking, one doesn't have to believe in a post-millennial framework in order to adhere to the, applicability of the Old Covenant. I don't think. At least I've never seen a real consistent, demonstration why there's a logical necessity there.
But it does seem like it's really common amongst the hardcore theonomists.
I would say 95, 97% of them, and definitely 100% of its leaders, right?
Yeah.
The reason for that is because, for them, the kingdom of heaven is not something that's strictly spiritual, right? It's not something that's outside of this world. It's something that's soon going to enter this world and have, severe, strict and physical ramifications, right? And under the postmillennial framework, that's part and parcel of preparing the world for the return of Christ, preparing the law, the civil institutes, the church itself, for Christ to come down and lead it physically. That's part of the whole transition. And so therefore, if you're going to run a society based on this thing, you've got to have a legal system. And the legal system, of course, is going to be the very legal system that God put into effect, 2,000 years ago. And by 2,000 years ago, I mean 4,000 years ago.
The effect of the belief seems to be that they, as Christians, are responsible for building the kingdom of God, not in a spiritual sense, as most of us who have, I think we'll call it the more commonly held belief then, is that the kingdom of heaven is already but not yet. that there is a part of it that is within us, and that it is coming forward through us by the changing of the Holy Spirit of our hearts. It emanates from us in our behavior and our interactivity with other people, especially through the church. And so that's the already, but it's also not yet. We have a hope for the future that at the second coming of Christ, that the world is changed, and what that looks like could a variety of different things could come to pass. And that's not my business necessarily to decide which one of that it is. That's God's business. But we know that it's coming. This postmillennial belief in particular here, it's even different than some other postmillennial beliefs, in that that they're literally trying to physically bring forward the like you said, the institutions that will prepare for the coming of Christ, which is a very different way of thinking about the second coming.
I want to add to that if for libertarians who are theonomists, how do they expect to accomplish this without the use of violence, or without, like, where does their sort of anti-state bias, how does that complement what Norman just described?
Yeah, so first of all, I do think there's kind of a spectrum of our involvement in the preparation for the second coming, right? So there's some people that are much more active in how they're supposed to prepare the way, and there's some people where it's a little bit more passive, right? So that's Norman's point, and I agree with it. I don't have too much more of a further comment on that, but you did mention what do libertarians who are theonomic do about that difficulty. First of all, I actually don't think it's possible to be a theonomist and a libertarian. I think one is really stressing the bounds of proper exegesis to say that everything in the civil law of the Old Testament was voluntary, which is what they would have to believe in order to keep their libertarianism pure, right? I don't think that you can actually hold to that. Generally speaking, I think that it's okay to say that a theonomist or a theonomic framework allows for a smaller government, a less invasive government in our lives, at least economically, than our current status society. But I don't think, logically speaking, that there is a possibility of having both of these at the same time. I do think there was initiation of force against the property rights of persons and their property in the theonomic system. That's going to lead to other objections by the theonomist. And, if you guys don't bring them up, I could point out one of them. It comes up immediately. But
hey, do it.
I don't think you can be both. I think that the libertarian is strictly and consistently against the intervention of not just the government, but any individual, the intervention of anybody against his property rights. And the theonomist, I think, has to decide whether he's going to. Yeah, they have to make exceptions, and the framework is different. So, anyways, the objection that the theonomist is going to bring up is that, hey, if you're complaining that the theonomic system allows for interventions into man's property rights, but that means that you're choosing the so-called rights of man over the just law of God, which implies, dear libertarian, that you are calling God's law less just than your libertarian law, right? So that's the objection, and of course the answer to that is that God's law is just in the sense that it was what He commanded of the individuals under that covenantal framework. So people are acting justly when they obey God's commands. But if those specific commands are no longer applicable, then we can't say they're just to enforce today. Then there's the logical incompatibility with His other commands, which is, summarized by things like, the commandment that we shouldn't initiate, or that we shouldn't murder, which, as Charles Hodge and John Gill and other theologians have said, even Calvin said this, implies that man is not allowed to initiate for all kinds of force, right? Hans Sennholz, the Austrian economist, said the same thing. So there's a good tradition of using that covenant as a blanket statement against the initiation of force.
So the moral law, in a sense, implies libertarianism, is what you're saying.
Well, yeah. So let me talk about that. So, one of the things that I think that theonomists ignore is the classical, what's called the threefold division of the law. Okay, and this is a tricky one because they say, okay, Mr. Libertarian, you've got your what you're saying is that you're going to renounce the applicability of God's law today. Does that mean, therefore, that you think murder is fine, lying to your parents is fine, all these things, right? But the answer to that is that we make a distinction between the eternal moral law, that's a transcendent law, that it's not bound by a specific covenant, but is rather a command on individuals from Adam to the last man, right? There's this moral law, also called natural law, that sits above the covenantal context and isn't bound by it. Okay, so that's the moral or natural law. Calvin equated the two phrases. Okay, so in Protestant, Reformed history, moral law is the same as natural law, and this is a different type of natural law than other traditions. But nevertheless, by natural law, we just mean the law that's independent of the positive law, or the law that's bound by a specific covenantal context. So we distinguish between that natural law and the positive laws, which include the Mosaic civil law. That's why it's always important that we define the Reconstructionism by the qualifier Mosaic, because it allows us to later come back and distinguish between moral and civil or positive laws. So then we get into something called general equity, which is the tool that allows us to distinguish between or take the ongoing or eternal truths out of the civil law. So if a civil law said, if the husband kills,
all right, well, that's all the time we have today on the Libertarian Christian
lashes,
podcast.
Right?
Thank you for joining us, and we will see you next time. We're signing off live from the Young Americans for Liberty 2017 National
general
Convention.
Equity, we take the underlying principle out of this very specific case, and we make it applicable to everybody, of all time, right? So we don't say, so the civil law says the husband isn't allowed to kill his wife lest he receive 40 lashes. That's the positive law. That means that today we aren't required to give someone 40 lashes for killing his wife. But the general principle of that law is that people shouldn't kill each other. And that's the moral principle that we're going to take out of that. And apply and make it an ethical stipulation about human action.
Well, it sounds like you're reading the Old Testament in light of the gospel when you apply those kinds of, when you read the scripture that way.
Yeah, absolutely, I am. So I think that the new is the clarity. I think the new clarifies the old. I think what was dim before, what was confusing and blurry, has been clarified by the gospel, and suddenly everything is much more clear, and we can go back and look at what it really means in light of the fulfillment of all those things.
So you're saying that Jesus is a better mediator?
Yeah.
I'm just going to quote some scripture and just kind of, without identifying which one, I can just quote them all day long.
And then if I say no, then you can brand me as a heretic.
Well, one of the things that I'm noticing is it seems like, and again, we don't have a theonomist on here, so again, if you're listening and you are one and you feel like we're being unfair, that's fine. We can have a conversation and maybe get a guest on. But my initial impulse is to think there's a very huge gap in context, or let me say it this way: there's no context to when the Mosaic Law was written, in what century, to which people, under what circumstances, and it's just assumed that this is our book for today, rather than going back and saying, oh, okay, well, this was written to ancient Israelites who were under covenant with Yahweh, and we are followers of Jesus, and how do we read that sacred text that Jesus saw as a sacred text? Like it just seems to me devoid of context. Am I being unfair? I mean, maybe you agree, because I know you're not a theonomist, but I mean, is there?
Well, I think that's possibly true for people who have just come into this and know it at a popular level. I think that though theonomists' key leaders, anyone from R.J. Rushdoony to Gary North, to Greg Bahnsen and James Jordan, I think all of them are kind of, they took these things into account. I think that they took the difficulties of the nature and applicability of the covenants into the equation when they were trying to solve these difficulties. I do think that I think that they had good intentions at heart, but I do think that you're right. I think at a popular level, sometimes the nuances and nature of shifts in the covenant over the course of redemptive history becomes kind of background noise, and they don't pay attention to it. So I would say that's true for some, and I definitely have recognized that, online and in conversations and stuff. But just to be fair, I think that its leaders do recognize, these components.
I just want to follow up with something a little earlier. You mentioned that you don't quite see the compatibility between theonomic Reconstructionism and libertarianism. What would their defense be in why it's Christian libertarians, we have to go through this defense of why it's compatible to be a Christian and a libertarian. So obviously they've got, we understand that people don't understand why we think it's compatible. And so you and I, the three of us, are sitting here thinking it's not compatible. What is their defense?
I think that they define libertarianism a little bit looser than I do. I think they define it in kind of a vague, man needs to be free from the government sort of way, without getting precise about what it means. So I think that's one component of it. I think the other part too is they're trying to, they've fallen for the theonomic trap, right? And they don't know how to properly respond to the trap. And so they just accept the fact that they have to choose between, God's law and man's law. And so therefore, for piety's sake, they choose God's. And they also appreciate the developments of libertarianism as a general movement. And I think that they want to push two together. The problem with being precise is it can sometimes force you to have to make difficult decisions. And I think that when we define libertarianism in a very strict way, I think that it, by necessity, excludes the possibility of believing in the theonomic conclusions. The other thing too, though, I think that we don't necessarily need to show the differences between libertarianism and the application of theonomy. If we can just root out theonomy just as a more general, biblical framework question, so there's my point there is that we don't necessarily have to show that they must choose by logical necessity. The nature of theonomy includes actions of violence against property rights. I don't think that we have to necessarily show that. We can. I think it's definitely doable. I've done it before myself. But I think just by exposing the misunderstood nature of covenants, I think is a much better and easier thing to do. At least it's less time consuming to start there.
Okay, so that's really good. And so I'd like to kind of conclude here with some the kind of quick takeaways that people who are listening can go away with and remember for when they get into that conversation with a theonomist, or when they encounter some of their writings and they're trying to remember some of the foundational things that we've talked about today. What are some of those quick points that anybody who's listening can kind of take away today, you think? I think for me, at least, the first one is that we really want to be clear about our definitions, especially about what does libertarianism really encompass? And we've talked about that already, that it is fundamentally about how we deal with conflicts, how we deal with the appropriate use of force. But what are some of the other things that you kind of take away from here and hope that people would remember, CJay?
I think the biggest thing for me is that we are under the economy of a new and better covenant. It's not just that we have a better administrator of a covenant, but it's actually that the covenant has been ended. It's been abrogated. I think that it's over with. And I think that there's a new and better covenant that we need to recognize is better, not just because it has a better leader, but also because the features of it are so much better. It offers salvation. The old covenant did not promise salvation. The old covenant promises a relationship. If you're in that covenant, promises a relationship with Christ. And I think that the new covenant, being a different covenant, really sets the groundwork for us understanding how the Mosaic law fits for today. We can draw general principles of it, and we can learn about the nature of God by reading those things, but we don't need to use force to apply those same civil laws to society today. I think it's a distraction from the gospel. So the biggest thing I think is, for me, is that we live under the economy of a much better covenant. I think that libertarianism, properly defined, necessarily excludes the possibility of holding to a theonomic position at the same time. So those are, two important things. I think the other thing too is that we need to focus on the, spiritual nature of the kingdom of heaven, and not focus on making the world a better place as a fruit of our Christianity. I think that making the world a better place for our kids is a great thing. I love talking about culture and things like that too, but I think that it's a separate issue from the specific nature of the kingdom of heaven. So those are the 3 things that I would take away.
Good. All right. So one of the last things we want to do here then is make sure that everybody knows exactly where they can go find you and your writings, and to give them further things to read and think about. So tell us about how to find you and contact you on the internet, if that's all right.
You can probably find me on Facebook, and find me at any time. Look for CJay. CJay is how I stylize my name. CJay Engel, and reformedlibertycom is my primary website, so you can always find contact information there. But feel free to message me or email me, or pretty easy to get a hold of. Excellent.
And so, yeah, definitely take a look at the Reformed Libertarian Facebook group, and you can search for that, and that's a great place to join in some good conversation. And we look forward to ever so much more great work from you, CJay, and we enjoy everything you guys are doing. And so we're very thankful to have you on the show today.
Thanks, guys.
So finally, if you'd like to reach out to us and ask a question or submit some feedback, you can always reach us at podcast@libertarianchristians.com, as well as on Facebook, Twitter, and of course our website, libertarianchristians.com. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.
The Libertarian Christian Podcast is a project of the Libertarian Christian Institute, a registered 501c3 nonprofit. The audio engineers were Doug Stewart and Jason Rink, and voiceovers were by Matthew Bellis and Caitlin Horn. If you'd like to find out more about the LCI, please visit us on the web at www.libertarianchristians.com.